Daniel Wells pressed his back against the cold metal door and listened. Outside, the wind had stopped completely, and that silence felt wrong in a way he could not explain. 3 hours ago, this research station on the edge of Bell Harbor Island had been full of noise, generators humming, radios crackling, people laughing over coffee. Now there was nothing. No wind, no voices, no static, just the sound of his own breathing and the faint scratching noise coming from somewhere beneath the floor. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He had spent 11 years studying wildlife in some of the most remote places on Earth, and he had never once felt afraid of an animal. Fear was for people who did not understand behavior, who did not understand patterns. Daniel understood patterns. That was his job. But nothing about the last 6 weeks had followed a pattern he recognized, and that terrified him more than anything he could name. The scratching stopped. He held his breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Then it started again, closer this time, moving along the wall toward the door he was leaning against. Daniel closed his eyes and thought about how he had gotten here, how a routine survey of an unmapped island had turned into something he still did not have words for. 6 weeks earlier, Daniel had led a team of 4 onto Bell Harbor Island. It was a small landmass off the coast of a larger, mostly uninhabited region, chosen because satellite imaging had picked up unusual movement patterns in the dense forest at its center. Nobody expected much. Islands like this usually held nothing more than birds, insects, and the occasional wandering mammal that had drifted in on a fallen tree years before. His team was small but sharp. Laura Bennett handled data and mapping, quiet and precise, the kind of person who noticed details others missed. Peter Hale managed equipment and logistics, always joking, always trying to lighten the mood when things got tense. Grace Whitfield was the youngest of the group, a graduate student, eager to prove herself, sharp-eyed and endlessly curious. And Nathan Price, the station's engineer, kept everything running, though he rarely spoke unless something needed fixing. On their 3rd day on the island, Grace found the first nest. It was tucked beneath the roots of an old fallen tree, hidden so well that she nearly stepped on it before noticing the small shapes curled inside. She called the others over immediately, her voice trembling with excitement rather than fear. The creatures inside were small, no larger than house cats, with smooth gray skin, large dark eyes, and long thin limbs that seemed almost too delicate for their bodies. They did not run. They did not hide. They simply looked back at the humans with an attention that felt, even then, slightly too aware. Daniel remembered crouching down that day, notebook in hand, feeling the particular thrill that came with discovering something new. He had cataloged dozens of unknown insects and a handful of unknown reptiles over his career, but never anything like this. The creatures had no obvious classification. They were not quite mammal, not quite anything else he recognized. Laura suggested they might be an entirely undocumented branch of life, isolated on this island for who knew how long. For the first week, everything felt like the best kind of scientific discovery. The team set up quiet observation posts around the nest sites, careful not to disturb the animals more than necessary. They recorded feeding habits, movement patterns, vocalizations that sounded almost like humming. Grace named the species informally, calling them otherin, a word she made up that stuck with the rest of the team simply because nothing else felt right. The otherin were curious. That was the word Daniel used in his early notes. They would approach the observation posts at dusk, standing just far enough away to remain out of reach, watching the humans with what looked like genuine interest. Peter joked that they were probably taking notes on the researchers the same way the researchers were taking notes on them. Nobody thought much of the comment at the time. It was Laura who first noticed the mimicry, 4 days into the 2nd week. She had been reviewing footage from one of the motion-triggered cameras when she paused on a clip that made her call the rest of the team over. In the video, one of the otherin stood near the edge of the camp, watching Peter as he struggled with a tangled length of rope, his frustration clear in the way he yanked at the knot and muttered under his breath. The creature tilted its head, watched him for a long moment, and then reached toward a nearby vine with its thin fingers, pulling at it in the exact same motion, the exact same rhythm, even mimicking the way Peter had thrown up his hands afterward. At first, everyone found it fascinating rather than troubling. Mimicry was not unheard of in the animal kingdom. Parrots copied sounds, some primates copied gestures, and highly intelligent species often displayed behaviors that mirrored what they observed around them. Grace suggested this could be one of the most important discoveries in decades, a species capable of complex social learning, at a level rarely seen outside of humans and a handful of primates. But the mimicry did not stop at simple gestures. Over the following days, the team began noticing that the otherin were not just copying actions, they were copying emotional expression. When Nathan grew visibly annoyed while repairing a generator that kept failing, one of the creatures near the tree line began making a low, sharp sound, almost like a growl, though the otherin had no vocal structure that should have allowed for such a noise. When Grace laughed at something Peter said, two of the creatures nearby made a light chittering sound that mirrored the rhythm of her laughter almost exactly. Daniel started documenting this more seriously, staying up late each night transcribing his observations by lamplight. He wrote that the creatures appeared to be studying emotional cues, with an intensity that went beyond simple mimicry. They seemed to be testing reactions, watching closely, to see what would happen if they repeated an expression back to the person who had shown it. It was less like an animal copying a sound, and more like something learning a language. The team's mood began to shift by the end of the second week. It was subtle at first, small comments here and there. Peter stopped making jokes around the observation posts. Nathan began keeping his frustration to himself, working in silence rather than muttering the way he used to. Grace, who had been the most enthusiastic about the discovery, started asking Daniel quiet questions when the others were not around, questions like whether he thought the creatures understood more than they were letting on. Daniel did not have good answers for her. He told her what he told himself, that they were documenting an extraordinary new species and needed to remain objective, that fear was not a scientific instrument. But even as he said it, he found himself glancing toward the tree line more often than he used to, watching for shapes that might be watching back. The first real incident happened on the 15th day. It began as something small. Peter had been trying to fix a broken latch on one of the supply crates, a simple task that should have taken minutes. The latch kept slipping, and after the fourth failed attempt, he slammed his hand against the crate and swore loudly, the frustration finally breaking through the calm he had been forcing himself to maintain. From the tree line, nearly a dozen otherin appeared at once. They had never gathered in that number before. Until then, the team had only ever seen them in twos or threes, cautious and spread out. But that afternoon, as Peter's voice rose in anger, the creatures emerged together, standing in an almost perfect line at the edge of the clearing, all of them staring directly at him. And then, in eerie unison, they mimicked his exact gesture, raising their thin arms and striking the air in front of them with the same sharp motion he had used against the crate. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Peter lowered his hands slowly, his anger replaced by something closer to unease. Grace reached for her camera, but her fingers were trembling too badly to hold it steady. Laura simply stared, her scientific detachment cracking for the first time since they had arrived on the island. Daniel remembered walking forward that day, trying to project calm he did not feel, speaking slowly to the group about how remarkable this was, how important it would be for understanding social behavior in previously unknown species. But even as he said the words, he was watching the creatures' eyes, and he could not shake the feeling that they understood exactly what effect they were having. That night, nobody slept well. Daniel lay in his tent listening to sounds from outside, sounds he could not fully identify, soft movements circling the perimeter of the camp long after the fire had burned down. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself the otherin were simply drawn to the warmth and light. But somewhere beneath that explanation, a different thought had begun to take root, one he was not yet willing to say out loud. The following morning, Grace approached him privately, before the others were awake. She told him she had reviewed more of the footage overnight, and found something she thought he needed to see. In one of the clips from 2 nights earlier, long before the incident with Peter, several otherin had gathered near the edge of camp while the humans slept. On the recording, they were not simply watching the tents. They appeared to be practicing. The footage showed the creatures reenacting fragments of behavior they had observed throughout the week, small gestures of frustration, sharp movements, raised voices reduced to low sounds since they had no true vocal cords for speech. They repeated these fragments to each other in the dark, correcting one another when the mimicry was slightly off, refining it the way a person might rehearse a phrase in a new language until it sounded right. Daniel watched the footage twice before he spoke. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than he intended. He said that what they were witnessing was not simple mimicry anymore. It looked closer to study. It looked like the Otherin were not just observing human behavior. They were preparing for something, learning the shape of human emotion the way a person might learn to imitate an accent before using it in conversation. Grace asked him what he thought they were preparing for. Daniel did not have an answer. He told her he did not know, and that not knowing was the most honest thing he could offer her. But privately, watching the gray shapes moving at the edge of the trees that morning, he understood that something on this island had shifted, and there was no way to go back to the version of this expedition that had begun only 2 weeks earlier. The Otherin were no longer simply a discovery to be recorded and studied from a safe distance. They had begun studying the researchers back, and whatever conclusions they were drawing from that study, Daniel had the growing sense that his team was about to find out exactly what those conclusions meant. By the end of that day, Laura had stopped smiling entirely, and Nathan had quietly moved his sleeping mat closer to the center of camp. Peter avoided the supply crates altogether, letting Nathan handle anything that might trigger frustration. And Daniel, lying awake that night with his notebook open on his chest, wrote a single line before closing his eyes. "They are learning what makes us angry, and I do not think they are finished learning yet." By the 3rd week, Daniel had stopped calling the daily briefings routine. What had once been a relaxed exchange of notes over breakfast had turned into something closer to a strategy meeting. 4 exhausted people trying to decide how to continue a study that no longer felt safe to continue. Grace sat with her knees pulled to her chest, sketchbook open but untouched. Peter kept glancing toward the tree line every few minutes, as if expecting the Otherin to appear the moment their name was spoken. Laura had taken to writing everything twice, once in her official log, and once in a private notebook she kept tucked inside her jacket, something Daniel noticed but chose not to mention. Nathan was the first to suggest they should call for early evacuation. He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said most things. He told the group that whatever they were dealing with had moved past simple animal behavior, and that continuing to observe it up close was no longer a reasonable risk. Daniel understood the logic, but he also understood what a request like that would mean for his career, and more importantly, what it would mean to walk away from what might be the most significant biological discovery in a generation without a single conclusive answer. Instead, Daniel proposed a compromise. They would establish stricter boundaries around the camp, reduce direct contact to controlled observation windows, and begin recording everything with long-range equipment, rather than field notebooks taken at close range. Laura supported this immediately. Grace, still torn between fear and fascination, agreed reluctantly. Peter said nothing for a long moment before finally nodding, though the tension in his shoulders never fully eased. For a few days, the new boundaries seemed to help. The team kept their distance, watching from behind a ring of motion-triggered cameras and long lenses rather than standing in open clearings. The Otherin, in turn, seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm, appearing less frequently, moving with less obvious intention. Daniel allowed himself to hope that the worst of it had passed, that perhaps the earlier incident had simply been an unusual burst of activity rather than the beginning of something larger. That hope did not last. On the 19th day, Grace noticed something in the recorded footage that changed the tone of the expedition entirely. While reviewing overnight recordings, she found a clip showing 3 Otherin gathered near one of the cameras, close enough that their faces filled most of the frame. They were not simply looking at the camera, they were looking directly into the lens, unblinking, for nearly 4 full minutes. Then, one of them reached out with its thin fingers and touched the base of the camera itself, adjusting its angle slightly before stepping back. When Grace played the footage for the rest of the team, nobody spoke for a long time. The idea that these creatures understood not just human emotion but the function of human technology, that they recognized the camera as something meant to observe them, and had responded by repositioning it, was almost impossible to process calmly. Laura suggested, carefully, that this behavior indicated a level of problem-solving intelligence far beyond anything previously recorded in an undocumented species. Peter suggested, less carefully, that it meant the Otherin had figured out they were being watched and did not appreciate it. Daniel spent that night reviewing every piece of footage they had collected so far, searching for a pattern that might explain what they were seeing. He found something unsettling in the process. Cross-referencing timestamps, he realized that every documented instance of aggressive mimicry, every case where the otherin copied a moment of human frustration or anger, had occurred within minutes of that emotion being expressed loudly or physically. Quiet irritation seemed to draw little response. But visible anger, raised voices, sudden movements, these things seemed to trigger something specific in the creature's behavior, something closer to fascination than fear. He began to form a theory, tentative and difficult to say out loud even to himself. It was possible, he thought, that anger itself held some kind of significance to the otherin, that the team did not yet understand, that this particular emotional state was not simply being mimicked out of curiosity, but was being studied because it meant something important within whatever social or biological framework governed their behavior. He shared this theory with Laura first, late one night while the others slept. She listened carefully, asked several sharp questions, and then admitted she had been thinking along similar lines. She pointed out that in many species, aggressive display served specific evolutionary purposes, establishing dominance, defending territory, signaling readiness to fight. If the otherin lacked a natural equivalent of their own, it was possible they were drawn to human anger the way a creature might be drawn to a behavior it recognized as powerful, but did not fully possess itself. Daniel found the theory unsettling, for reasons he could not fully articulate. If it were true, it meant the otherin were not simply curious about human beings in general. They were specifically interested in provoking and observing anger, perhaps even collecting it, in some way that remained entirely outside human understanding. The next incident occurred on the 22nd day, and this time, there was no ambiguity about what had happened. Peter had gone to check one of the outer equipment stations alone, against the team's agreement to always move in pairs beyond the inner camp boundary. He returned nearly an hour later, pale and shaking, refusing to explain what had happened, until Daniel sat him down and asked directly, slowly, haltingly. Peter described finding a group of otherin gathered around the station, more than he had ever seen together before, easily 20 or more. They had not approached him. They had not made any threatening movement. They had simply stood in complete silence, watching him, with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. And then, all at once, every one of them had mimicked the exact expression of fear on his face. He said it was not the aggressive mimicry from before. It was something quieter, and somehow worse. Dozens of creatures perfectly reflecting his own terror back at him, their faces arranged into something that should have been impossible for their anatomy to produce. He said he had turned and walked away as calmly as he could manage, forcing himself not to run, because some instinct told him that running would change something about the moment, in a way he did not want to test. That night, the team gathered around the fire, and had the argument that had been building for days. Nathan repeated his call for evacuation, this time more forcefully, pointing out that they had documented enough behavioral data to justify ending the expedition and requesting a proper scientific team with better resources and protective measures. Peter agreed with him immediately, his earlier hesitation gone entirely after the encounter at the equipment station. Grace was less certain. She admitted she was frightened, more frightened than she had ever been in the field, but she also pointed out that they were on the edge of understanding something extraordinary. A species with a level of social and emotional intelligence that could reshape entire fields of study. Leaving now, she argued, without any conclusive data on what the otherin were actually capable of, would mean abandoning the most important work of their careers, based on fear rather than evidence. Daniel found himself caught between both positions, unable to fully commit to either. He understood Nathan's caution, and privately, he shared it more than he wanted to admit. But he also understood Grace's argument, because it echoed the same reasoning that had convinced him to continue observation after the very first incident. He was, he realized, no longer entirely capable of separating scientific curiosity from something closer to obsession, and he did not know when that line had blurred. In the end, they reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely. They would remain on the island for one more week, using the most conservative protocols possible, keeping all direct contact restricted to distant observation and remote recording equipment. If nothing changed, if the situation escalated further, they would call for immediate evacuation, regardless of how much data remained uncollected. Nathan reluctantly agreed. Peter agreed with visible relief. Grace agreed with visible disappointment. Daniel signed off on the plan and told himself it was the responsible choice. The following days passed with an uneasy calm. The Otherin appeared less frequently near the camp, though the cameras positioned deeper in the forest continued to capture activity. Groups of them gathering in clearings, engaging in behavior the team could not fully interpret from a distance. Laura spent hours analyzing the footage, cataloging what appeared to be some kind of structured social behavior, individuals taking turns performing gestures, while others watched attentively, almost like a rehearsal or a lesson being passed among them. It was during this quieter period that Daniel made the decision that would change everything. He had been reviewing Laura's analysis late one night, struck by a detail she had flagged but not fully explored. In several of the recordings, one particular Otherin appeared repeatedly at the center of these gathering sessions, seeming to lead the others through whatever behavior they were rehearsing. Its markings were slightly different from the rest, a faint pattern along its back that none of the others seemed to share. Daniel began to suspect this individual held some kind of elevated role within the group, perhaps something like a teacher or an elder, and the scientist in him could not let go of the possibility that studying this one creature more closely might unlock everything they had failed to understand so far. He told himself he was not violating the agreement they had made. He told himself that a single, carefully controlled, non-invasive observation of this individual, conducted from a safe distance with proper equipment, fell within the boundaries they had set. He did not tell the rest of the team what he was planning, not because he intended to deceive them, but because he suspected, correctly, that they would try to talk him out of it. 2 days before the agreed evacuation date, while the others slept, Daniel left the camp alone, with a single handheld tracking device and a small case of sedative equipment meant for safe temporary containment. Equipment that had been packed for emergency use only, and had never been discussed as part of any active plan. He told himself he only intended to observe the marked individual from a distance, to confirm his theory about its role within the group before the team left the island for good. He found the creature exactly where the recent footage suggested it would be, alone in a small clearing near the center of the forest, sitting motionless in a patch of pale moonlight, as if waiting for something. Daniel crouched at the edge of the clearing, tracking device in hand, close enough to record clear footage but, he believed, far enough to remain safe. The creature turned its head slowly and looked directly at him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Daniel felt his heart pounding, some instinctive part of his mind screaming that this was different from every previous encounter, that this was not curiosity or mimicry, but something closer to recognition. The creature tilted its head slightly, the same gesture he had seen dozens of times before, but this time it felt less like observation and more like an invitation, as though it were waiting to see what he would do next. Daniel raised the tracking device slowly, intending only to record, and it was in that single moment, driven by exhaustion, obsession, and 11 years of scientific instinct telling him not to let this opportunity slip away, that he made the decision that would set everything else in motion. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the creature, reaching toward the sedative case at his side. Behind him, in the darkness beyond the clearing, he heard movement. Soft, deliberate, and multiplying, the sound of many small bodies shifting through the undergrowth at once, converging toward the same clearing where he now stood, entirely alone. Daniel froze, with his hand still hovering near the sedative case, listening as the soft movement in the undergrowth grew louder and closer. He turned slowly, and what he saw made every rational explanation he had built over the past 3 weeks collapse at once. The clearing was no longer empty. Dozens of Otherins stood at its edges, more than he had ever seen gathered in one place, their dark eyes catching what little moonlight filtered through the canopy above. They had not been drawn by noise or sudden movement. They had arrived in complete silence, as though they had been waiting nearby the entire time, anticipating exactly this moment. He lowered his hand from the sedative case immediately, every instinct telling him to retreat rather than continue. The marked individual in front of him had not moved, still watching him with the same unsettling stillness, but now it tilted its head toward the gathered group behind it, a motion that felt, impossibly, like an introduction rather than a warning. Daniel took one slow step backward, then another, keeping his eyes on the creature in front of him, rather than the crowd surrounding the clearing. For a moment, he believed he might be able to leave the way he had come, quietly and without incident, and he promised himself silently that he would never make a decision this reckless again. But as he turned to retreat toward the tree line, he saw that the path he had walked in on was no longer clear. Several otherin had moved to stand along it, not blocking him aggressively, but positioned closely enough that passing through without contact would be difficult. He felt the first genuine wave of panic since arriving on the island, a tightness in his chest that made it hard to draw a full breath. He forced himself to stay calm, reminding himself of everything he knew about wildlife encounters. That sudden movement often triggered defensive responses, that the worst thing he could do now was allow fear to control his actions. He raised both hands slowly, palms open, and spoke in a low, steady voice, more to steady himself than because he expected the creatures to understand him. The marked individual took a single step closer. Daniel held his ground, his mind racing through every possible response. He thought of Grace's footage from the equipment station, the way the creatures had mirrored Peter's fear back at him with unsettling precision, and he understood in that moment that whatever happened next would depend heavily on what he allowed his own face and body to communicate. He forced his expression into something as neutral as he could manage, breathing slowly, refusing to let the panic building inside him surface outwardly. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. The creature studied him, and he studied it in return, neither moving, the rest of the gathered group standing in near-perfect silence around them. Then, slowly, the marked individual reached out one thin hand and touched the tracking device still held loosely in Daniel's grip. He did not pull away. Later, he would not be able to explain exactly why, only that some instinct told him resistance in that moment would be far more dangerous than stillness. The creature's fingers moved gently over the surface of the device, exploring its shape, and then it looked back up at him with an expression that, for the briefest moment, looked almost curious rather than threatening. That was when everything changed. A sharp, sudden burst of static erupted from Daniel's radio, clipped to his belt, the emergency channel used only for camp-wide alerts. The noise cut through the silence of the clearing violently, and every otherin present reacted at once, their calm stillness shattering into a chaos of sudden movement, sharp chittering sounds, and rapid, jerking motions that reminded Daniel of startled birds taking flight all at the same instant. The marked individual recoiled from him sharply, and in the confusion, Daniel stumbled backward, catching his foot on an exposed root and falling hard against the ground. Pain shot through his ankle, and for a terrifying moment, he could not tell which direction led back toward camp. The creatures around him were moving fast now, no longer silent, their earlier calm replaced by something closer to alarm, and Daniel understood with sudden clarity that the radio burst had frightened them just as much as it had frightened him, perhaps more. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his ankle, and pushed through the scattering creatures toward what he hoped was the direction of camp. Branches tore at his jacket as he ran, the sounds of the forest around him a chaotic mixture of rustling movement, and those strange chittering calls, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt less like panic now and more like communication, dozens of voices calling something to one another across the darkness. By the time he stumbled back into the lit perimeter of camp, Laura, Peter, Nathan, and Grace were already awake, alarmed by the same emergency signal that had triggered the chaos in the clearing. Nathan had accidentally knocked the radio's alert switch while reaching for his boots in the dark, a mistake that would later feel like the single most consequential accident of the entire expedition. Daniel collapsed near the fire, breathing hard, his ankle throbbing, and it took several minutes before he could explain what had happened. When he finally did, the reaction from the team was immediate and furious. Nathan was the angriest, accusing Daniel of violating the agreement they had all made together, of risking not just his own safety, but the safety of the entire team, through a decision he had made entirely alone. Peter was quieter but no less shaken, staring into the fire as though trying to process what Daniel's account meant for everything they thought they understood about the otherin. Grace, surprisingly, was the one who asked the most important question. She wanted to know exactly what had happened in the moment the marked individual touched the tracking device, what its expression had been, what Daniel believed it had been trying to communicate. Daniel admitted he did not fully know, only that it had not felt aggressive, that it had felt closer to genuine curiosity interrupted by sudden fear. Laura, who had remained mostly silent through the argument, finally spoke. She pointed out something that none of the others had considered yet. If the sudden radio burst had triggered such an intense, coordinated reaction among the gathered creatures, it suggested their fear response, much like their anger response, might be far more sensitive and far more communal than anything previously observed in known species. A single sharp, unexpected sound had scattered dozens of individuals into what looked like organized panic within seconds. The team did not sleep again that night. They sat around the fire until dawn, going over every detail of what had happened, trying to piece together an explanation that made sense within the framework of everything they had documented so far. By the time the sun rose, exhausted and shaken, they made the decision unanimously, including Daniel, that the expedition would end immediately. They would begin breaking down the camp that morning and request emergency extraction, rather than waiting for their scheduled departure. The problem was that extraction was not immediate. Their transport had been scheduled for 4 days later, and requesting an earlier pickup meant routing communication through their research institution's emergency channel, a process that, on a remote island with limited connectivity, could take anywhere from several hours to over a day to confirm. Nathan sent the request the moment they had signal, and then the team began the tense, uncertain process of waiting. The other end did not appear at all that first day, an absence that felt somehow more unsettling than their usual presence. The team worked quickly and quietly, packing equipment, dismantling observation posts, moving with the kind of efficient urgency that came from wanting to be anywhere else. Daniel's ankle had swollen significantly overnight, and Grace insisted on wrapping it tightly, working in silence as she did, occasionally glancing toward the tree line as though expecting movement that never came. By the second day, still without confirmation on their extraction request, the isolation began to weigh on all of them. Nathan checked the radio every hour, his frustration growing each time static was the only response. Peter had stopped speaking almost entirely, focused instead on securing every piece of equipment, as though bracing for something worse than what they had already experienced. Grace stayed close to Daniel, helping him move around camp despite his protests that he could manage on his own. It was Laura who noticed, late on the second afternoon, that the forest around them had gone completely silent. Not just the absence of the otherin, but the absence of everything: birds, insects, the usual low hum of a living forest. She mentioned it quietly to Daniel, who felt a fresh wave of unease settle over him as he realized she was right. The island felt as though it were holding its breath. That evening, as the team ate a quiet, tense dinner near the fire, the marked individual appeared at the edge of the clearing alone. It stood at a distance, farther than it had ever kept during previous encounters, watching the camp without approaching. Daniel rose slowly, ignoring the ache in his ankle, and the rest of the team fell silent, watching him watch the creature. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, the marked individual raised one hand slowly, in a gesture that mirrored nothing Daniel had shown it, nothing any of the team had displayed before, an entirely new motion, deliberate and unmistakably intentional. It was only much later, reviewing the footage captured by a nearby camera, that the team would understand what that gesture meant. In the moment, none of them could say for certain whether it was a warning, an apology, or something else entirely beyond their ability to interpret. The creature held the gesture for several seconds, then turned and disappeared silently back into the tree line, and it was the last time any member of the team saw an otherin directly for the remainder of their time on the island. Extraction confirmation finally came through late on the third day, a transport scheduled to arrive the following morning, nearly a full day ahead of their original departure date. The relief in the camp was immediate and visible, though it was tempered by an exhaustion that had settled deep into all of them. Nathan finally allowed himself to sleep properly for the first time in days. Peter began humming quietly to himself as he finished packing, something he had not done since before the mimicry incidents began. Daniel spent that final night reviewing his notes one last time, trying to organize weeks of chaotic observation into something that would make sense to people who had not lived through it. He wrote carefully about the mimicry, the apparent fascination with anger and fear, the coordinated group behavior, the unsettling intelligence behind eyes that should not have been capable of holding that much understanding. He did not yet know that these notes, along with nearly everything else the team had documented, would never be allowed to see the light of day in the form he intended. The transport arrived early the next morning, and the team boarded quickly, equipment loaded in a rush, none of them looking back toward the tree line as the boat pulled away from the shore. Daniel remembered watching the island shrink behind them, half expecting to see movement along the coastline, some final gesture from the creatures they were leaving behind. There was nothing, just dense green forest and the pale line of the beach, growing smaller until it disappeared entirely behind the curve of open water. What none of them understood yet, sitting exhausted and relieved on that departing boat, was that the true difficulty of Bell Harbor Island was only beginning. Within days of their return, representatives from their research institution would arrive with instructions that had nothing to do with publishing their findings, and everything to do with making sure those findings never reached anyone at all. The debriefing began less than 6 hours after the team landed back on the mainland. Daniel had expected questions about scientific findings, about classification, about the extraordinary behavioral patterns they had documented. Instead, he found himself sitting across from two representatives from the research institution's compliance division, people he had never met before, whose names he would later struggle to remember clearly, as though even his memory of them had been deliberately blurred. The questions they asked were not about the Otherins' intelligence or their social structures. They were about protocol violations, about the sedative equipment removed from camp inventory without authorization, about the emergency signal that had been triggered during an unsanctioned solo excursion. Daniel answered honestly at first, believing that transparency was the only responsible path forward. It quickly became clear that honesty was not what the institution wanted from him. By the end of the first day, all 4 team members had been separated for individual interviews, and by the end of the second day, they were presented with documents that none of them had expected to see. The paperwork described the expedition's conclusion in language that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. Equipment malfunction, unstable terrain requiring early evacuation, no mention of the Otherins' mimicry, their apparent fascination with anger, the marked individual, or the incident in the clearing that had nearly cost Daniel far more than a swollen ankle. Daniel remembered sitting in a small conference room, the non-disclosure agreement placed in front of him, and asking the compliance officer directly why the institution seemed uninterested in what could be the most significant biological discovery of the century. The officer's answer had been calm, professional, and utterly evasive, something about liability concerns, about protecting the integrity of future research, about the importance of allowing proper channels to determine how such findings should eventually be released, if at all. He signed the document. They all did. Grace hesitated longer than the others, reading each line carefully, asking questions that received only vague reassurances in response. Peter signed quickly, eager to put the entire experience behind him. Nathan signed without argument, his earlier fury from the island having faded into a kind of resigned exhaustion. Laura signed last, and Daniel noticed she kept her private notebook, the one she had written in alongside her official logs, tucked carefully inside her jacket, rather than surrendering it with the rest of her field materials. In the weeks that followed, the team scattered. Nathan took a position at a research facility overseas, and largely stopped responding to messages within a year. Peter left fieldwork entirely, transitioning into a teaching role at a university that had no connection to the institution that funded the Bell Harbor expedition. Laura remained in contact with Daniel for a while, exchanging occasional emails that grew shorter and less frequent over time, until eventually they stopped altogether. Grace, the youngest and most idealistic of the group, struggled the most visibly, taking a leave of absence from her graduate program that quietly extended into a full withdrawal. Daniel himself continued working within the institution for another 2 years, though something in him had changed permanently. He avoided fieldwork whenever possible, taking administrative roles instead, telling himself it was simply a shift in career interest, rather than an inability to trust his own judgment in the field again. He rarely spoke about Bell Harbor Island, and when former colleagues occasionally asked about the expedition, he offered the same vague, rehearsed explanation the institution had provided, an answer that felt increasingly hollow each time he repeated it. It was Grace who broke the silence first, nearly 6 years after the expedition ended. She reached out to Daniel unexpectedly, an email with no subject line, containing only a single sentence asking whether he still had any of his original field notes from the island. Daniel had not thought about those notes in years. Not directly, though the memory of that clearing, the marked individual's raised hand, the sound of many small bodies moving through darkness, had never fully left him. He wrote back cautiously, asking why she wanted to know. Her response, when it came, described a discovery that unsettled him more than he expected. Grace explained that she had spent the past several years working independently, piecing together fragments of information related to Bell Harbor Island whenever she came across them, driven by a need to understand what had truly happened that she had never been able to shake. She had located public shipping records showing that a private survey team had visited the island twice more in the years since their expedition. Neither visit connected publicly to their original research institution. She had also found, through a contact still working in administration, that the institution's internal archive contained a file related to Bell Harbor Island that had been marked as permanently restricted, a classification typically reserved for material involving significant legal or safety concerns. Daniel read her message 3 times before responding. He asked her what she believed this meant. Her answer was direct in a way that surprised him. She believed the institution had never actually stopped studying the Otherin. She believed their team's expedition had simply been the first documented contact, and that whatever had happened afterward had been deliberately kept separate from public or even internal scientific record, handled instead through channels designed specifically to remain invisible. He wanted to dismiss her theory as the product of years of unresolved anxiety about an experience none of them had ever properly processed. But he could not shake the memory of how quickly and thoroughly their own findings had been buried, how efficiently 4 separate researchers had been separated, documented, and silenced within days of returning from the island. It was not the behavior of an institution uninterested in a discovery. It was the behavior of one working very hard to control exactly who knew about it. Grace asked to meet him in person, and after several days of hesitation, Daniel agreed. They met at a quiet cafe far from either of their current homes, a location Grace had chosen deliberately, and Daniel noticed she seemed to check the entrance every few minutes throughout their conversation, a habit that unsettled him more than anything she actually said. She had brought a folder with her, thin but carefully organized, containing everything she had managed to gather over the years. Photocopied shipping manifests, a partial internal memo she would not explain how she obtained, referencing something called Continuation Protocol Bell Harbor, a blurry photograph, taken from what appeared to be a significant distance, showing a fenced enclosure on a section of coastline Daniel recognized immediately despite the poor image quality. He asked her where she had gotten the photograph. She told him a former contact, someone who had briefly worked logistics for a private contractor, had sent it to her anonymously over a year earlier, along with a short message warning her to stop asking questions about the island. She had not heard from that contact since, and every attempt to reach them again had gone unanswered. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest as he studied the photograph. The fencing was substantial, industrial in scale, clearly not something erected for casual research purposes. Whatever was happening on Bell Harbor Island now, 6 years after their own hurried departure, it was being conducted with resources and secrecy, far beyond anything their small research team had ever possessed. He asked Grace what she wanted to do with the information. Her answer was simple and unwavering. She wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside of restricted files in private folders. She wanted, at minimum, for the other 2 members of their original team to know what she had found, and she wanted Daniel's help piecing together the rest of what had happened in the years since their departure, using his remaining institutional knowledge and contacts to fill in the gaps her outside research could not reach. Daniel hesitated. He had spent 6 years building a quiet, careful distance from everything related to that island, and the idea of stepping back into it, particularly into something that increasingly looked less like a buried research finding and more like an active, ongoing operation someone was determined to keep hidden, frightened him in a way he had not expected. But looking across the table at Grace, at the exhaustion and determination in her expression, he understood that whatever peace he had built for himself over the past 6 years had always been temporary, built on top of a silence he had never actually resolved. He told her he would help. Over the following weeks, working carefully and separately to avoid drawing attention, they reconnected with Laura, who admitted she had kept her private notebook safely hidden all these years, unwilling to fully let go of what she had witnessed, despite never speaking about it publicly. Laura's notebook contained details their official reports had omitted entirely, including a section describing the marked individual's final gesture in far more depth than Daniel remembered discussing at the time, an observation Laura had recorded, but never shared with the rest of the team, out of uncertainty about what it truly meant. According to Laura's notes, the gesture the creature made on their final evening on the island had not been random. She had studied the recorded footage repeatedly during their last days in camp, comparing it against earlier documented behaviors, and had come to believe the motion was not a warning or a farewell at all. It appeared, according to her analysis, to be an attempt at a specific kind of communication, something closer to a question than a statement, though she had never been able to determine what that question might have been. Peter proved harder to reach. When Grace finally managed to speak with him by phone, his responses were short and guarded, clearly uncomfortable revisiting a period of his life he had worked hard to leave behind. He confirmed only one new detail before ending the call quickly, telling them that roughly 2 years after the expedition, he had been contacted by someone claiming to represent a private research group interested in his experience on Bell Harbor Island. He had declined to speak with them and had not heard anything further, but he remembered feeling, at the time, that the call had not felt like a random inquiry. It had felt like someone checking whether he still remembered enough to be a problem. By the time Daniel, Grace, and Laura had compiled everything they could gather, a clearer, more troubling picture had begun to form. Someone, whether their original institution or an outside party that had gained access to the discovery afterward, had continued studying the Otherin in the years since their team's hurried departure, and had done so under conditions designed specifically to prevent public knowledge, scientific oversight, or accountability of any kind. What none of them could yet answer was why. What had happened on that island in the years since their departure that required this level of secrecy? What had become of the marked individual, and the dozens of other Otherin, who had once gathered so carefully around a small clearing to study 4 exhausted, frightened researchers? And whether whatever had been built behind that industrial fencing was designed to observe the Otherin, or to contain something about them that someone, somewhere, had decided the rest of the world was never meant to understand. It was Laura who suggested the plan that would ultimately bring all 3 of them back to Bell Harbor Island, though not one of them fully agreed to it without significant hesitation. She had maintained a distant professional relationship with a documentary journalist named Claire Dawson, someone she had worked with years earlier on an unrelated wildlife project, a person known for careful, evidence-based reporting, rather than sensationalism. Laura proposed reaching out to Claire, sharing what they had gathered, and asking whether she would be willing to help them investigate further, using resources none of them possessed individually. Claire agreed to meet within days of receiving Laura's message. She arrived with a small independent film crew, only 2 people beyond herself, and made it clear from the beginning that she would not publish anything without solid, verifiable evidence. She reviewed Laura's notebook, the photocopied documents Grace had gathered, and the blurry fenced enclosure photograph, asking careful, pointed questions that none of them had thought to ask themselves. By the end of their first meeting, she had agreed to help them pursue the story, though she cautioned all 3 of them that institutions capable of maintaining secrecy for 6 years rarely did so without significant resources and significant motivation to continue protecting that secrecy. Over the following month, Claire's investigation moved faster than any of their independent efforts had managed. Using contacts within maritime shipping records, she confirmed regular supply deliveries to Bell Harbor Island continuing through the present day, routed through a private contractor, with no publicly listed connection to Daniel's former research institution. She traced ownership of that contractor through several shell arrangements before finally identifying a parent company with a broader, quietly maintained portfolio of biological research holdings, none of which appeared in any public scientific literature. The deeper Claire's team dug, the more apparent it became that whatever operation was continuing on the island had grown significantly beyond the scale of the original team's small research camp. Satellite imagery, difficult to interpret with certainty but suggestive nonetheless, showed structures along the coastline that had not existed during their expedition, along with what appeared to be a small private airstrip carved into a cleared section of the island's northern edge. Daniel found himself increasingly uneasy as the investigation progressed, caught between the relief of finally understanding more about what had happened after their departure and a growing dread about what that understanding might ultimately reveal. He thought often about the marked individual, about the deliberate, careful gesture it had made on their final evening, and found himself wondering whether that creature, or any of its kind, had survived whatever had been done to them in the years since. 6 weeks into the investigation, Claire received an anonymous message through a secure channel she had set up specifically for the project. The message contained a single video file, no accompanying text, sent from an account that led nowhere when her technical contact attempted to trace it. When they gathered to view the footage together, Grace visibly braced herself before Claire pressed play, as though some part of her already understood that whatever they were about to see would be difficult to watch. The footage was short, poorly lit, clearly recorded covertly rather than officially. It showed an interior space, industrial in appearance, rows of enclosures visible along one wall, though the recording never lingered long enough for any of them to count exactly how many. In several of the enclosures, shapes moved that were unmistakably otheran, though their numbers seemed far greater than anything the original team had ever documented on the island itself. The most disturbing portion of the footage came near its end. A figure in protective equipment entered the frame, approaching one of the enclosures while reviewing something on a handheld device. The otheran inside reacted immediately, its movements sharp and agitated, and though the recording had no clear audio, the creature's posture and rapid gestures were unmistakably familiar to everyone in the room. It was the same aggressive mimicry they had documented years earlier, anger reflected back with startling precision, except this time it was directed at a technician who appeared entirely unbothered by the response, as though it were simply an expected, catalogued behavior rather than anything remarkable. Laura was the first to speak after the footage ended, her voice tight with barely controlled anger of her own. She said what all of them were beginning to understand but had not yet said aloud, that whoever was running this operation had not continued studying the otheran out of scientific curiosity or careful, ethical research interest. They had continued because they had found a use for what the original team discovered, specifically, the creature's unique and intensely reactive relationship with human anger, and that use, whatever it turned out to be, had required scale, secrecy, and complete removal from any oversight capable of questioning it. Claire's investigation, combined with the anonymous footage, gave her enough material to begin drafting a story, though she remained cautious about publishing without additional verification. She reached out formally to the parent company, identified through her ownership research, requesting comment on the nature of their operations on Bell Harbor Island. The response, when it came 2 days later, was not a denial. It was a legal notice, threatening significant consequences for publication of what it described as misappropriated and inaccurate information regarding a legitimate, privately funded conservation initiative. The notice named Claire directly, along with Daniel, Grace, and Laura individually, citing the non-disclosure agreements each of them had signed years earlier as grounds for immediate legal action should any of them speak publicly about their original expedition or anything related to it since. Grace, reading the notice, felt something shift inside her, a fear she had lived with quietly for years, finally taking a concrete, threatening shape. Despite the pressure, Claire made the decision to publish a limited version of the story, one carefully constructed to avoid direct legal exposure, while still raising public questions about the parent company's activities on Bell Harbor Island. The article that eventually appeared was cautious, heavily qualified with language like alleged and reportedly, avoiding direct reference to the otheran by name, and instead describing unconfirmed reports of undisclosed biological research being conducted under conditions that limited independent oversight. The public response was smaller and quieter than any of them had hoped for. A handful of independent outlets picked up the story briefly, framing it alongside other examples of corporate secrecy and private research funding. A few online communities focused on unexplained phenomena seized on the story with far more enthusiasm than accuracy, quickly surrounding it with speculation that had little connection to anything Claire had actually verified. Within roughly 2 weeks, public interest faded almost entirely, buried beneath a constant stream of other, more immediate news. The parent company never issued a formal response beyond its initial legal notice. No further legal action followed, something Claire found almost more unsettling than if it had. She explained to the others that an organization confident in its legal position typically pursued exactly the kind of high-profile lawsuit that would discourage future reporting. The fact that they had chosen silence instead suggested they preferred the story simply fade away on its own, unamplified by the additional attention a public legal battle would bring. Daniel found himself thinking often, in the months that followed, about what the true purpose of that research facility might be. Every explanation he considered felt incomplete, whether related to some undisclosed scientific application of the other's unusual emotional sensitivity, some commercial interest in whatever biological mechanisms produced their remarkable mimicry, or something else entirely that none of them had enough information to properly imagine. Grace continued reaching out to contacts occasionally, though the trail Claire had uncovered grew colder with each passing month, the parent company apparently tightening its operational secrecy in response to the brief attention their story had generated. Nearly a year after the article's limited publication, Daniel received a package with no return address, delivered to an old mailing address he had not used in years, somehow still forwarded to his current home. Inside was a single item, wrapped carefully in plain paper. It was a smooth gray stone, unremarkable in every way, except for a faint, irregular pattern etched across its surface. A pattern he recognized immediately from the markings along the back of the individual otherin who had approached him so carefully in that clearing years earlier. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to confirm who had sent it or why. Daniel sat with the stone for a long time that evening, turning it over in his hands, thinking about the deliberate gesture the marked individual had made on their final night on the island. The question Laura's notes suggested it might have been trying to ask, a question none of them had ever been able to answer. He called Grace and Laura separately over the following days, describing what he had received. Neither of them could offer any explanation beyond speculation. Laura suggested it might have come from the same anonymous source that had sent Claire the original footage, someone still working within the operation who felt some obligation, whether guilt or genuine concern, to maintain a thread of connection to the original researchers. Grace suggested something quieter and more difficult to say aloud, that perhaps it was not a person who had sent it at all, that perhaps some connection to the other in themselves, however impossible that seemed, had never fully been severed. Daniel did not know which explanation, if either, was correct. He kept the stone on his desk after that, a small, quiet reminder of everything that remained unresolved. He continued his work within the scientific community, though he never again pursued fieldwork of the kind that had brought him to Bell Harbor Island in the first place. He spoke to Grace and Laura regularly now, the three of them maintaining a connection forged by an experience none of them could fully share with anyone else who had not lived through it. The last confirmed sighting of an otherin, at least according to everything the three of them had been able to determine, remained their own final evening on the island, nearly 7 years earlier, that single deliberate gesture from the marked individual before it disappeared into the tree line for the final time. Whatever continued behind the fencing Claire had photographed from a distance, whatever purpose the parent company had built its quiet, secretive operation around, remained entirely outside public knowledge, protected by legal threats, corporate silence, and the simple, effective passage of time that eventually caused even the most extraordinary stories to fade from public attention. Daniel often found himself thinking about what Laura had said, early in their investigation, about anger, about the reason the otherin seemed so specifically drawn to that particular human emotion above all others. He had never fully resolved his own theory from those first uneasy weeks on the island, that anger held some significance within the otherin's biology or social structure that remained fundamentally outside human understanding. But increasingly he found himself wondering whether the significance had never truly belonged to the otherin at all. Perhaps what those creatures had reflected back at his team, so precisely and so unsettlingly, was never really about their own nature. Perhaps it had always been a mirror, held up carefully and patiently, showing the research team something about themselves they had not been prepared to see. He never learned what became of the marked individual, or the countless others documented briefly in that covert footage before the trail went permanently cold. He never learned what the parent company's true purpose had been, or whether the operation on Bell Harbor Island continued still, hidden behind fencing and legal threats, and the quiet, deliberate silence of people determined to keep it that way. What he understood, sitting at his desk some evenings with the marked stone turning slowly between his fingers, was that some discoveries were never meant to reach a clean, satisfying conclusion. Some things remained buried, not because the truth was too dangerous to survive exposure, but because too many people, for too many different reasons, had decided that some truths were simply easier left unspoken. And somewhere, whether on that quiet island or somewhere else entirely, something continued watching, patiently learning, waiting to see exactly what humanity would do the next time it found a reason to be angry.